Don't say anything outlandish. As
And that's why I told Hank Crocs are the only way to go.
fuzzy
Hello,
insole
everyone.
Crocs.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 6 of the 60-day novel challenge. Or, maybe your first time here if you're joining us from NaNoWriMo or for NaNoWriMo. This is a show that we are putting on as part of our 60-day novel challenge, where right now we are in the midst of writing, just as everyone is for NaNoWriMo as well. And we spent the first month going through, planning out our stories, getting to know our characters, getting to know Dabble, if it was the first time someone was using Dabble. And now we're just in the writing phase. So where that first month was more theory, more exercises, more homework, now the only homework is to write, and we're just here to really chat about the process of writing, to chat about our experiences, our hurdles, and to answer any questions. Yeah, as Mady says here, writing talk.
Writing talk. Like it.
Yeah. So, all right. So I guess we'll run through some quick introductions, because I also know a lot of people have been joining us for writing sprints, but they might not actually know who I am, who Hank is, Josh, who you are. So I'll go first, I guess, because on my screen I'm top left. I think I'm top left for everyone. So I'm Doug. As you can see here, Arcane Master of the Literary Arts, self-given title. Means absolutely nothing. And I'm responsible for the premium content for Dabble, and I do a lot of these fun live shows, make a lot of resources for dabblers. Mostly just get to help writers with their writing. That's what I do from 9 to 5. And on top of that, I'm a dark fantasy author and editor, I guess urban fantasy author as well. Hank, what about you?
I am Hank Garner. I am author of 15 books, I think it is, if you count the ones that I've co-authored and pen named, and a number of short stories and different things like that. And I work for Dabble also as our internal podcast host and content creator of all manner of motivational and exciting content to bring everyone in the writer community closer together to achieve our dreams and goals.
That's good.
Yeah,
I'm scared to go to Josh now.
Yeah, that was completely
Look,
off
I don't
spine.
have any cue cards set up. I can't do that.
Yeah, but I mostly write magical realism, fantasy-ish stories. Kind of real life with a touch of the extraordinary, shall we say?
Yeah. All right, Josh, what about you?
Well, I'm Josh Hayes. I have written and published 14 science fiction novels, mostly military science fiction. I'm working on 15 and 16 right now. The first draft of 15 has been done, and I've been rewriting it for like a year. And the draft of 16 is like halfway done. And I am now working on a modern day kind of military quasi-spy novel for this challenge that I was just working on up until like 4 minutes ago when I hopped on here. I've been writing full-time since 2019, and I am also the operations manager and head of thriller acquisitions for Athon Books.
Excellent.
Nice.
That's pretty good. Nothing to shake your head
at. A lot
at.
of hats.
Yeah,
it's a couple of hats. Yeah.
I think most of us wear a number of hats, and I wouldn't have it any other way. One hat all day long, too boring. Yeah, multiple hats. Yeah, multiple hats. So, guys, I'm at we're day 5 now, and I'm just looking at I have my Dabble project open here, and the sidebar is open showing my NaNoWriMo stats, and so far written, I've got 15,631 words with 26 days left. I was, the first day or two, I said, well, it's because we had the planning month and I had so much in my head that I just had to get out. It was like there's going to be this huge flood the first day or two while I got out all the stuff that had been building up, but it hasn't slacked off. I have so far today, I've gotten 2,624 words. And honestly, I probably have a couple more pages I could write that I might get in this evening. I don't know. There's
When you're
nothing
supposed
going
to be
on.
working.
Well, there's nothing going on TV tonight or anything. Nothing to watch. So probably, might as well write.
As the resident Canadian at Dabble, there's nothing going on TV for me, so so maybe I will write. But no,
although
that is
the second season of The Diplomat just came out on Netflix, and that is some phenomenal writing. If you haven't watched that series, check it out. It's really, really good.
Donna and I watched episode 1 the other night, and excited to watch the rest. It's good TV for sure.
Now, Hank, something that you mentioned there is, I guess, what we'll start a conversation with today for this show is this momentum at the beginning. We expect it to fizzle out a little bit. It might carry on longer than we think.
Yeah.
But what are some strategies that you two have been using to capitalize on this kind of excitement of writing the start of a story, of starting NaNoWriMo, or a month of writing? Of writing so much. Josh, you write full time, so maybe the same excitement isn't there, but it's a new story. So I'll get your take on that as well.
Yeah.
We'll start with you.
I'm actually starting out kind of slow. I'm at about 5,000 so far. I actually did some writing on my phone on the Dabble browser deal on my phone at my kids' volleyball game this weekend. But I'm working on the opening. The opening usually is most often the slowest for me, because I'm trying to do a couple of things at the same time. And it's probably not good for me to do this while we're trying to do this challenge. But it's something that's just part of my process, and so it's hard for me to get past it. But I do two things. One, I get to know the characters, because I don't know the characters other than their names and their jobs when I start. And also I have to write out some of the scene ahead of time so that I kind of can get myself into it, and then I go back through and take out all the exposition that I have written and replace it with dialogue and conversation. And part of that is so the beginning is not boring, and it's intriguing at the start. And so right now I'm just kind of going through and adding a little bit of color to that first chapter. So after I get past that, it should be really, really easy sailing after that.
That's cool. I've never thought of doing that before, of going back and replacing all the exposition with dialogue. What made you do that the first time?
I really like fast-paced reading, and with not everything, but there's a lot of things that writers use like exposition and narrative summary for that can be really quickly done in dialogue through context. I think context is, in my opinion, underutilized a lot of the times, because from my character's standpoint, they are experts in what they're doing and they understand what they're doing. And if I can get that across and just get the hint of what's going on through dialogue, I would rather do that than through narrative, because I feel like that's a little easier to get through as a reader, especially in the beginning of a book. As a reader, I don't like getting bogged down with exposition on, like, for instance, my characters are former MARSOC, that's Marine Special Operations, and in this scene, they're in an SUV. It's a really expensive SUV that his friend owns, and his friend is working for a private company. And trying to get all of that information in without making it boring or just unnecessary is really difficult. So I've gone the step of, instead of saying all of that in narrative, I'll have one of these guys say, the friend who's working in private security, he's wearing a really expensive suit to set him apart from the other guys that are all kitted out in like BDUs and like standard military getup. And so I have one of my characters say, well, it looks like uh you haven't lost everything except your fashion sense. And then he points out the expensive suit. And that kind of sets up, a history between the two and connects those two characters without having to say they were longtime friends. And I'll put in a line, something about, the tires screech. The person driving the car is not the owner, and the friend is the owner of the car, and kind of like grimaces a little bit because the tires are expensive. And the main character says something to the effect of, "You'll be glad she's driving if this goes sideways," and kind of just like seeding in things about character without actually having to go like really in depth about it. A lot of that, like just quick context dialogue,
It's gonna
really
say
builds it a
context
little bit.
clues that let you into
Right.
the what's going on without having to explicitly say it.
100%. But to get to that point, I have to usually write out 3 or 4 paragraphs of what I need to get across, and then I just go back through and pepper it through the scene.
Understood.
Interesting. I
I
really
like
like
that.
That might have been
Um,
like a long rambling thing, but
No,
I
no,
tried
it's
to.
good. Sunza, I see that you have a question there. I'm gonna save that for the Q&A at the end, unless it's immediately related to the topic that we're at, just for the sake of flow. But what I want to point out from what you just said, Josh, is when people think about show don't tell, or when they wonder about show don't tell, that kind of rule that most authors want to apply when they can, that's kind of exactly what I want people to think about. When you have a character grimace because the tires are being put through the ringer, that shows that they care about these expensive tires, that expensive stuff matters to them without having to say it explicitly in 3 lines of exposition. That's perfect.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Awesome.
You should do this
Hank,
full time, Josh.
yeah.
Ah!
uh, Hank, what about you? How's the opening been going? How's all that?
Openings are always very easy for me. I love to write openings. I love to set the stage. I love to build mystery and tension in the beginning. I love to write scenes that draw readers in, and then I love to stick those endings. The middle is always, the um, has the tendency to not be the fun part, but because we spent so much time planning, I was able to build in uh, ebbs and flows to the story structure so that hopefully I'm able to maintain that excitement from the beginning with twists and turns, which kind of build that excitement all over again. So the beginning has gone swimmingly well, but they usually do for me. That's the easy part for me, because that's when my the synapses are firing, and the great ideas come as when you're thinking about all the different ways to excite the reader, and so it's been going very well. But I expected it to. That this part of the process is usually very exciting and very easy for me. So nothing nothing out of the ordinary so far.
See, I actually found my opening has been a little tough for me. I really knew what my first scene was going to be, maybe my first chapter, but we've since pushed through that with all the writing sprints we've been doing. And I know what's coming in the middle. I know all those exciting things that I want to put
Mhm.
my character through. But now there's these couple scenes that I find myself meandering a little bit and then course correcting and then being like, "Ooh, this is a good idea. Let's go there." And yeah, so I'm really in the spirit of this challenge. I'm just kind of brute forcing my way through it just so I can get to more into the second act. But it's been tough for me, this opening. I'm not going to lie, which is
Really?
abnormal for my writing. I'm going to be honest. I think for most writing.
Is it because this is these are novellas that you're writing that are going to fill a gap in your stories?
No, they're prequel novellas.
Okay, prequel novellas. Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think I'm leaning too much into one aspect. Like it's tough to elaborate in a show like this. I'm leaning too much into one aspect, and that's kind of overshadowing the rest of my writing. And so I need to pull back a little bit and just, have fun with it. Just enjoy the story. Right?
Yeah.
Josh, when you're doing that more concise writing, when you go back and replace that exposition with dialogue, Valentine here said, I struggle with thinking people will feel my story goes too fast because I don't like scenes that don't have real meaning. So I think they're saying that when you have those shorter, faster scenes, how do you make sure that the impact is still there for an author, or for a reader rather?
Well, I mean, it just boils down to the scene. I think of the structure of a novel in scenes and sequences, and the sequences are the bigger portions of the scenes, and then the individual scenes kind of break that down even more. And so when I look at a scene, I the most important thing is, what is the scene supposed to do? But then I also look at, what can I put in that scene that elevates other things that aren't necessarily part of that central idea for the scene, whether it's character or backstory or relationship or whatever it is. Sometimes uh, what you're writing, if is more than just the central idea of the scene that you're trying to tell, and you can, instead of having, you know 3 or 4 pages of backstory to introduce a character, you can, I think I said this last week too, you can take some of that backstory and filter it in through multiple scenes, in different ways, either through dialogue or even narrative. Because I do that too. I don't do everything in dialogue. I do have exposition in there that's necessary for the story. Um, but if your scene is too, uh, if you think the story is going too fast, because or you have really short scenes, look and see what you can do with those scenes that are either combining the ideas of those scenes into a longer one, or filling that scene in with a little bit of color. Sometimes, in some stories, you can get really connected to uh, the the actual element of the story that you're telling. Whether, if you're plotting, you're like, this is the plot point for the scene, and you get really tied to that. And sometimes you can forget the other things that add color or flavor to the story, that are simple things to add in but aren't necessarily individual scenes in of themselves, and then you can layer those in through the other scenes if they're shorter, on the side. I had that, a lot of trouble with that when I first started, and I remember thinking, uh, that my stories, I couldn't envision myself getting to 100,000 word story, and I would get to 50,000 words and the story would be almost over. And I was like, I don't really understand how these authors are writing these really long books, 100,000 words, 200,000 words, until I started looking at the color of the scene. And by that, it's not the meat, but just the color and the flavor that you put in there, that make it, set it apart from anything else, or put other aspects of it that's not just story. And then I was able to, now I can't write short. uh, it's a meme for me. I've written short stories for several anthologies, and a couple of the anthologies, I always turn them in, and the only thing I send in the email is, I'm sorry, because the word count was 10,000 words, and I turned in a 15,000 word short story, because I have a really hard time cutting all that stuff out.
Yeah.
Josh Sanderson Hayes.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Blackblade said here, in reference to what I said about my writing, brute forcing way through it resonates, and that's how it feels for them. In my case, not enough planning was the reason, maybe. Honestly, for me, it might have been that I planned too much, and so I know what I'm coming towards, and I'm excited for it, And so getting there is the struggle now, those few thousand words to get me to what I want to write most. And realistically, you can just jump ahead. You don't have to. One of the questions we'll tackle at the end from Sunza there is about linear writing and jumping, between scenes. But when you're writing, you don't have to write linearly. You don't have to write chronologically. Your story might be, scene after scene after scene in chronological order, but you can go ahead and write wherever you want if you're excited about it. I just kind of want to get this part done so I can get to the exciting stuff.
For me, the way I've been writing for the last 5 days, specifically, is that I know exactly what I'm going to write for the day. I know exactly what my scene needs to accomplish, and I will draft usually pretty quickly about 1,200 words that kind of hits all of those points and lays the bones of the chapter, so to speak, so that all of the story beats are covered, just not in detail. And then I'll come back a couple of times a day in our writing sprint, which which is what I was doing, um, because I had the scene already written, but I was going back and, like Josh said, adding color, uh, adding skeletal tissue to the bones of the skeleton at first, and then later today I'll make another pass and put clothes on that this corpse that I'm creating. Boy, that analogy just went way bad, didn't it?
That's a Doug analogy right
Yeah.
there.
I've been hanging around you too much, Doug.
Halloween's over, Hank.
I know. It's November. I'm trying to.
I saw Christmas
hold my-
decorations on my walk yesterday.
Did you?
Yeah.
All three of my daughters put up their Christmas trees over the weekend. All three, and yeah.
My upstairs is now completely Christmas. I spent hours getting down the totes out of the garage.
Yeah. So good luck putting that genie back in the bottle.
Mm.
But anyway, that's the way I'm approaching it. Is I lay that foundation and then I go back and, like our friend Steve talks about, onioning, going back and adding layer after layer after layer to it, until then you start with like a 1,200 page or 1,200 word chapter, and all of a sudden it's like 2,700 words, and it still accomplishes the same exact thing. You haven't done anything different to it, but there's nuance, there's context clues, there's things that, and because you've planned the whole story out, maybe there's some foreshadowing that you can drop in subtly here or there because that these things are coming, and you can throw in a sentence here or there, or a short paragraph that doesn't add or detract from the story in any way, but later on when you're reading the novel, it's these little things that make the difference, and that's one thing I'm really appreciating about the writing of this current book.
So I want to backtrack even a little bit. I know we're going to get into the second act in a couple minutes here, but Hank, you just told us your process while you're writing a scene, but I actually want to know from you too, what is your process or ritual or steps before you, like, as you sit down to write, or before you sit down to write, before you type those words? Like, are you making jot notes? Are you getting a candle set up? What do you do to make writing work for you?
Well, since it's November and I live in the deep South, it's still 80s during the day. It's mild summer like weather, but still pretty warm. And I've been taking my portable writing rig that I showed off there out to our patio in the morning, and writing out there. It's very breezy this time of year. The leaves are beginning to change, but we don't get the beautiful colors like you guys do up north. But it's a great thing, and I've never been one of those people that like holds their writing space as precious. Some people have to be at a certain place. They can only write when they're at their desk and with a candle burning and all of that. I've never been one of those people. But I'm really appreciating there's a certain ritual that is forming out of. I do that. I set my phone over on a chair next to me, and I open up my Spotify playlist and just kind of let it play ambiently. And I'm really enjoying that. I have a cup of coffee over there, obviously. and just that's what's really been working for me. So I still don't know that I'm one of those people that has to have things exactly the certain way before the muse will show up, but I am really enjoying that process. I don't know, it just shifts the gear for me and I go into creative mode.
And is there anything you do for like the scene itself? Like, do you reference your notes? Do
Yeah,
you?
I do. I will pull up my um my story notes, and I have 3 to 5 fairly detailed story beats of things that I know this chapter needs to accomplish, and I just read over them, kind of refamiliarize myself. And sometimes if something in those beats kind of triggers a thought of something that's coming up later in the story, and maybe a place where I could add some foreshadowing, so I'll just kind of have that in mind. Not really, um, I don't pin it up somewhere where I can see it, but I just kind of refamiliarize myself with what's coming up, and then just let it flow. So yes, I glance over my notes, so it's fresh on my mind, but I don't have them open where I can reference them constantly.
Josh, what about you?
I don't really have. I mean, the only process I have in the morning is getting coffee. I get that coffee and then I sit down. And whether I start writing right away or sometimes I've got other things I got to take care of before I can actually get the writing done. Um, but normally I just kind of open up the document and go. I'm sure I'm not unique in that my mind's always kind of chewing away on the story, whether it's just thinking about it or making a note here or there. A lot of times when I go to sleep at night, I'll think of something while I'm reading and jot a note down. Sometimes that affects what I write the next day. Sometimes it doesn't, but I always just sit down, open up the document that I'm working on, then take a look at the notes that I've made over the last couple of days and see if they affect what I'm writing that day. And then I just start punching away. Um, I if I start the morning writing, I'll usually go for an hour or two before I stop and do other things. But on any given day, I just typically sit down and go. I have a laptop. I can write wherever. I've written on my phone, like I said before. Um, I don't I don't have a block as some people do where they're not like in their space. I can just do
Mhm.
it wherever. A friend of mine, I won't mention his name because he might punch me, but he has he writes at his computer, but he also has what he calls his toilet novel, and that's what he writes on his phone. And he told me the other day, he's like, I've got this toilet novel I've been working on. I got 60,000 words in it. I think I might finish it. And I go, what are you talking about? And he's like, yeah, it's the thing. When I have to take care of business, I just open up my phone and write this book out. And it's not connected to anything else I'm working on. And I'm like, hey, man, do you? That's
You
cool.
know,
I need to try that.
not hating on him, but or her. I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whatever works.
Yeah.
Something you said, Josh, that your novel is kind of always kind of going over in your
Percolating.
mind. Yeah, percolating. Thank you. I'll take the dog out for a walk 4 or 5 times a day and just walk through the neighborhood, and I consider that writing time as well, because I'm usually kind of chewing on a story idea, or like I'll know what's coming up, and what would be a fun way to make this happen. And then when you sit down at the keyboard, you've untangled a lot of those little knots, that
Mm.
but I'm one of those people that thinks that if you're writing a novel, you're always writing a novel, and then
For
occasionally you
sure.
sit down at the keyboard and
Actually, right.
put that into bring it out of the ephemeral and into the to the real world.
My buddy he's my financial guy, and we were talking about uh income, and we were talking about how per hour he was asking me what I made per hour, and I'm like, I don't know. he's like, well, how much time do you spend writing? And I'm like, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours
All
a
the
day, like
time.
actually writing, right? Yeah, exactly. And he's like, oh, so you make, whatever it is, something, something an hour. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm always working. So like it really kind of matters if you're talking about like actually physically typing on the keyboard, or if it's
Right.
just me walking, like mowing the grass, daydreaming about what I'm going to be writing later. Does that count too? Because if that counts, I make like 35 cents an hour. Like,
Yeah.
Miss K here asking, anyone else dictate while you walk? I know a writer who does, but I never got dictating to skill. It is so hard at the
Yeah.
start.
I have so many friends that say that it completely changed their life, and it's honestly not a skill that I have practiced. I've done it a couple times. It just feels super awkward.
Mhm.
But I'll bet it's one of those things that if you can ever get past the awkward stage and really change the way you think about it, I'll bet it's life changing.
I've done dictation and I've done transcription. Actually, the new iOS update for iPhone has a really good transcription thing. If you do a voice recording, it will transcribe it for you, and it gets it pretty accurate. I used to have a micro digital recorder, and I'd walk around the neighborhood and record, and then I'd punch it into Dragon, and it would transcribe it for me. And what's interesting about that is I would just like I had a microphone on a cord, and then I'd
Mhm.
hit record and put the recorder in my pocket and just walk around. Well, more than once, I would get back to the computer, transcribe it, bring it in, and start editing it. And there's like just a whole bunch of text that doesn't mean anything to me. And it like I I stop and I say hi to somebody on the street, and that's all recorded in a thing. I got a
Mhm.
phone call one time, and it was like in the middle of whatever it was, just complete break. Hello? Yes. Oh yeah. Oh, I've been there. Yeah, I've done it. I'm like, what is going on? And then I remembered I took a phone call while I was walking around, and so I had to find the end of the phone call conversation and delete everything out.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
I've considered doing dictation while I walk, but I'll often walk my dog in the morning, and like the days are shorter now, so it's dark when we're out, and the last thing I need is somebody walking past me while I'm dictating, like rending flesh from bone or something like
Yes,
that. And yeah, I don't
100%.
need that people thinking about me like that in this neighborhood.
The
You
cops
don't
show
need that
up and they're
neighborhood
like, "You were
judgment.
talking
Yeah.
about kidnapping a child?" I'm like, "No, no, 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 I was writing a book, I promise."
Yeah.
Uh, all right. So, last week we talked about the first act, and we've had a number of days now to actually write it. Not a full week because we had to push the show early this week. But when people do get past their inciting incident, when their protagonist does push forward further into the story, we get into the rising action, which is just like some of my favorite stuff to write. Right.
Mhm.
So I want to hear about the rising action that's coming in both your stories and how you're approaching it. But first, Josh, I asked you either last show or the show before to define try-fail cycles because it's something that we mention a lot. But I know we have a lot of new people here who didn't get to hear that. So do you mind explaining to the audience what a try-fail cycle is and how we include it in something like the rising action?
Yeah, sure. So, I think we were talking about the middle of the book, and how a lot of people kind of get stuck in that. And try fail is basically you set up an objective, you have your character work towards that objective, and either they fail completely in accomplishing that task, or something happens while they're doing it that prevents them from finishing it, or finishing it changes something and it becomes a fail and not a succeed. And so you have these um a cycle of trying and failing and trying and failing, or trying and changing, or trying and getting a different result. And that uh progression through the book is what is pushing your reader through. That's what you want the story to do. You don't want to have the if the character succeeds at everything he does all the time, there's no tension, there's no mystery, there's no like, is the character going to live or survive or complete the task? You know he's going to do it. So what's the point? So if you have these cycles of try fail in your book, it leads it pushes very easily to the question of what's going to happen next. And the fail of the first cycle should naturally push into the try of the next one. And so it's always just kind of an up and down progression through the book, and each fail pushes directly to the next try, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And how do you balance it so that the reader doesn't just they aren't just reading about your character getting kicked over and over again?
Well, and that's where the kind of different outcome comes into play. So you can have a success, but that success leads to another try. So that success could be that I don't know, he made it to work that day, but he made it to work that day, and his boss uh, asked him to do a really hard job in like an hour, and so that he succeeded in getting to work, but now he has to try again and will probably fail in the next thing. So you can have like successions in that try fail cycle, but it can't those successes have to be metered to push into more tries. The final success of the book is, the ending, and then you're at the end of your cycle. But if you're not including those failures throughout the book, the success at the end of the book doesn't mean anything.
Right.
So you don't necessarily have to have your character fall down and get kicked every time. Uh, but you have to limit the amount of successes or meter them so that they're not taking away from the tension in the story. You always want to have tension. Um, you always want to have the reader thinking something bad is going to happen, or wondering how they're going to accomplish this, and that's pushing them through the story.
The tri-fail cycle is a great place to also introduce new information so that
Yes.
your character who is in the tri-fail cycle um, grows a little bit in each iteration, so that you don't give them all of the information, but you give them a piece so that when they try again, they get a different result because they have grown a little bit,
Hmm.
and through that process, they ultimately reach the goal without just handing it to them.
Yeah. Excellent. All right, Hank, tell me
Yes.
about your rising action. What's going to happen in your story as we get into the second act, and more importantly, what does it mean for the characters and the larger narrative you're trying to tell?
Well, the story I'm telling is a tale of two people on a road trip together, and one of them is a hitchhiker picked up by the other, and the hitchhiker is kind of sketchy, and he tells the driver that he's stuck in this cycle uh, of of going through different lives, if you will, because of a deal that he made with the devil at the crossroads. It's and then there will be flashbacks all through there as these characters are telling their stories to one another. So it's really kind of a uh, close cropped view, with these flashbacks that jump out along the way, and the second act is basically where the driver that picked up the hitchhiker realizes that he is being set up to be a sacrifice that the other guys has to take to the crossroads to um, pay the piper, so to speak.
Ooh.
So that's where the second act launches. Is that at first this old man is just telling the story. It seems like he's crazy at least, or sinister at worst. But he's just an old man telling stories, and then he realizes that he's meant to be the next victim, and so that's where um, the turn into the second act comes in.
Excellent. Very cool. Josh, what about yourself? What's on deck and why?
Um, so my story takes a turn when the team finds out that they're not dealing with a kind of inept local cartel gang. They're actually dealing with experienced and trained North Korean operatives, and that changes the stakes of the mission, but it also changes how they're operating, and obviously ramps that up. They also think that the North Koreans are just trying to steal this proprietary technology um, in order to sell it. But what they're actually doing is trying to kidnap and return to their country a defector who left like a decade before. And so it goes from just some gang members trying to steal some technology to some Korean assassins, basically, that are in the process of trying to kidnap a defector and his family. And so it really kind of ramps that up and becomes very personal for the characters that are involved, because they're really good friends with these people. And also, at the same time, the all of the friendly assets that are available to the team get taken away because they're not supposed to be there. And so not only do they have the escalation of opposition in terms of the enemy, but they also have opposition from their own friendly forces, and are being kind of handicapped in how they do it, because their access to all their good gear and resources is taken away. So they've got to face a stronger opponent with less resources.
Very cool. Excellent. Like very, very different stories we've got going on up here.
Yeah.
It's awesome. And not just like different, in their substance, but different in how the characters have to deal with things, right? It's all conflict, but it's different kinds of conflict and different stressors and whatnot. Mine, I just finished writing the inciting incident in the writing sprints we just had, where my main character gets separated from her friend. Separated in that they found a fellow angel dying on the side of the road, and it turns out that a magic bomb had been planted in him, and that drew in a whole bunch of baddies, and so that separated them. And it's just going to get worse for her when as the story progresses, and then she's going to be not just separated from everyone she knows and the people she relies on, but she is going to try to save some people and fail miserably at it, and then be given like a second opportunity to save more people, rise to the occasion, and somewhat succeed enough to get enough confidence to try for an actual escape, only for that to fail miserably at our midpoint. So all about that try fail.
I actually have the rising action. Obviously it happens throughout the whole book, but I've got a second turn planned where, after all of their resources been taken away and all of the opposition has been increased in significance, then the majority of the team that my main character runs is pulled away on an actual mission. And so he he ends up having to deal with it just by himself, his friend, and another person that they meet along the way. And that uh, extra turn like ramps it up even more, because you're trying to figure out how you're going to accomplish this with just the limited resources that you have. But now you have to do it with those limited resources and none of your team.
Yeah.
I like putting my characters in a tree and setting it on fire and then cutting it down.
Yes. Yes. It's interesting to see how the three of us are writing three very different stories, and there are certain aspects that are similar in the way we execute and the road we're carrying our readers down. But it's also interesting to see the differences in how tensions escalate, and how we're feeding information to the readers. It's genre specifics are fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, storytelling at its core is largely the same. Like, that's why we have things like story structure. They follow the same kinds of paths, but it's how you make it interesting and your own, and leverage genre, that makes a story unique, right? All right. Okay, so that is our rising action. I want to ask you, esteemed gentlemen, have I used that yet? I think I
You
have.
haven't.
Not
This is the first time
not
today.
today.
Okay, you esteemed gentlemen, about subplots. Now, Josh, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're writing 100,000 word novel. You're just trying to get the 50 in.
Very ish. Yeah.
Yeah, very, yeah. Whereas Hank, are you aiming for that 50,000 words, or are you aiming for
Well,
higher?
I'm obviously aiming for
Okay,
50,000 words, but I think in the end, we're going to be about 85,000
okay,
ish, something like
all
that.
right.
But what I plan to do is finish the novel in 50,000 words this month, and then go
Mhm.
back and
Add more.
layer that. So 50,000 word skeleton, if you will.
Yeah,
Don't know how
mine's
well that's going to work, but that's the
Mine looks
idea.
like it's going to be 50,000 words, which is long for a novella that I plan on giving away for free. But it is what it is. I'm just a verbose person and I write too much. But 50,000 words for me is difficult to balance as many subplots as I normally would in like a
Yeah.
160,000 word book, right? So, what's some advice that we can give the fine folks here who are writing 50,000 word novels for the most part in actually having relevant subplots and writing them, including them in the story itself? What's some advice we can pass on?
Oh, that's a good one.
I would say, in terms of a 50,000 word novel, um, you don't want to go overboard with your subplots, um, because you're not going to have, obviously, you don't have a lot of room to play around with, but you also want to make them very meaningful to the plot. Like some subplots could be, like a romance subplot between your two characters that doesn't affect the main story. If you're telling a longer book, that subplot would be an interesting way to explore that aspect of the story, but it doesn't technically relate to the larger story that you're trying to tell. And in a longer book, you can kind of go deeper into that and write more into that. In a shorter book, you wouldn't be able to do that as complex or as delicate as you could with a longer book. You definitely don't want to have, 3 or 4 or 5 subplots that either don't go anywhere or don't add anything to the story, um, just because you're going to have a lot of letdown at that point, without being able to have a full resolution to the subplot. I would say for a 50,000 word novel, have one, maybe
Mhm.
two, and have them be very closely connected to the main story that you're trying to tell. Because sometimes subplots can be a little bit distracting in terms of weaving them back in. And for me anyway, it could take 20,000 words to set up the subplot for me.
Mhm.
And then I'm gonna probably need the equal amount of time to weave it back in. Maybe 10,000 would be a better round number for that. But now you're talking about 20,000 words out of 50 that you're committed to a subplot, and you're not using those words to the main story. And it almost becomes like two separate main plots that you're trying to put down. So I would keep them very small and very closely related to the plot.
All right.
I have to agree with what Josh said. If you're if we're talking about a 50,000 word novel, um, subplots really should accentuate the main plot. Work hard on your main plot, and then look for places where a little side tangent could add color and texture to the story without adding another story.
Yeah.
Subplot being the uh the operative word there.
As an example, I have a an operative that works for the Chilean national government. She's a spy, and the subplot for her is that she's trying to crack down on these cartels and trying to crack down on these kind of foreign operators that are in her country. And so we follow her a little bit on that journey. And the that character and my main character, they have some interaction, but not directly. Like they never have a conversation with each other. They see each other, and they kind of have a back and forth in terms of a sequence that I have planned, but they don't actually meet each other until further on in the book. And the subplot that I'm using for her is so that she is in a position where she can help him at the end of the book. And so it's a it it for me, that particular subplot, setting that up is probably about 10 or 12 or 13,000 words to set that up, so that when it comes to the end and they decide to work together, it's not a surprise, and it's not like right out of left field, kind of Deus Ex Machina, kind of where she's just like, yeah, I'll help you. But if I set that up in a certain way, it makes it seem inevitable and realistic by the time you get to the end of the story. um, and it's important to the main story that I'm trying to tell.
Yeah. Shamina here asked, the project doesn't have to be finished at 50K and the end of November, though. No, it doesn't. You can write more than 50K. You can write 50K worth of 100K or 150K novel if you want, and then just keep writing it, like so many people have mentioned here. But there are some people who are aiming for writing a 50,000 word novel in the month from start to finish. So that's whether it's the 60-day novel challenge or NaNoWriMo, that's kind of the spirit of it. And then you just do whatever works for you, right? Whatever is necessary for your situation. Yeah. For my story, I'm including a bit of a relationship subplot that I already have a sequel planned, so it's going to evolve in that. I just need to lay the groundwork, and then I call it a subplot, but I'm again just sprinkling in some details about this gang that I want to bring back in the sequel, and they will be kind of the antagonists in that sequel. But it's not actually a full plot line in and of itself. I'm really focusing on my main character because 50,000 words is a lot to write in a month. It is not a lot when it comes to telling a story, especially the ones
Sure.
I'm used to.
Well, and to your point too, subplots work differently in terms of series versus a standalone novel. If you're writing a series, those subplots don't have to have closure at the end of your novel. It can set up something that happens in the second book or the third book. And that slow burn is really interesting for those kind of series. But if you're just writing a standalone book, all those subplots have to end up being resolved by the end of the book.
Yeah.
Have either of you guys ever read any of Michael Connelly's the Harry Bosch series novels, or
I
seen
think
the
I read
TV show?
based on
I
that.
think I read Black Ice back in the day.
Yeah, that's a very good series where he has subplots that definitely don't resolve in each book, but carry on for the next book. And it may be 2 or 3 books later that he picks one up, and you're like, "Oh, have I read this before? Oh, yeah." And then you
So
start
risky.
thinking about it's very very long-term thinking in the way that he sprinkles those in. But it really, when you look at it as a whole tapestry of the story, it's really brilliant the way he does it. That's
There's a
if you're
really
looking for an author to study, that's a good one. Craig Johnson, who writes the Walt Longmire series, is very good at subplots that are sprinkled throughout. That's a great series also to think about.
there's a really good example of slow burn and subplots in a show on Apple TV called For All Mankind. And in the first
Such a good
season, there is it's a subplot, but it's like out of context, it means nothing. And it's following this Hispanic girl as she's going to school or whatever, and her dad's a janitor at NASA, and you're like, what is this? Well, I don't understand why this is in here. And they never explain it in the first season. And it really doesn't pay off until like the second and third and even fourth seasons, where that character becomes a really big part of the show. But those kind of things are really interesting to do across series, where you introduce characters and you're like, I don't know why this guy's here. You get about that though. Sometimes if the reader doesn't trust what you're doing, you're not going to get uh, the reception from the reader that you think you might, because in your head you're like, oh yeah, this is going to pay off and it's going to be awesome. But if the reader doesn't trust you to know what you're doing, that could just be I don't understand why he had this chapter in here. It means nothing to the rest of the book. And then they just get frustrated with it.
Yeah. If you do that, even if you do it perfectly, you're gonna get some bad reviews on that first book
For sure.
when you leave the subplot
100%.
unfulfilled. But
Yeah.
like that happens, right? And sometimes it's your story. Tell it however you want. But yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to. I started watching For All Mankind, and I just got too busy. I never finished it, so I'm gonna need to get back into that one.
You know, compared to a lot of the things that are on TV, it definitely does not sit with everyone because it's
Mhm.
so like the burn is so slow. But the payoff is
Mhm.
amazing if you can get through the slow burn. In terms of writing and trust, if a no-name author would have done what Sanderson did in the Stormlight Archives with all the interludes, I don't think that those would have been received nearly as well as what he has done,
Yeah.
because some of those interludes don't connect to anything at all until like 4 books later, and they only connect to the people that understand the deep lore and what's going on in the story. Otherwise, they're like one-off, like glimpses of something that has no meaning to anything, and that's really difficult for someone to do.
Yeah. And I mean, Sanderson can do that not just because he's a very skilled author, but because he's earned the trust of his audience so much.
100%.
So
Yep.
yeah.
When he's also very vocal with his audience and has told them to expect that. Like
Yes.
he says, I'm creating a massive universe. You will see things that happen here that won't make sense. But when you read 8 more of my books, you'll
Right.
see, you know, things that leak in. And he's very intentional and very open with his audience about that, which is probably a lesson for another day for us to explore. You know?
When he comes on the show, we'll ask him
Yeah,
about
for
Right.
sure.
it. All right. And then last thing I want to chat about today as we get into the second act is the antagonist. Some people introduce their antagonist in the first act. Some people introduce them way later. Some people don't introduce them at all, or they're a force of nature or whatever. But I like to introduce my antagonists in the beginning of the second act, and I like to write scenes from their perspective. I enjoy that quite a bit. So I want to hear from you, above average gentlemen. What?
Slightly
Tell me
above.
about your tell me about your antagonists and how you're introducing them, what their role is, etc., etc. Hank, we'll start with you because I think
Okay,
you have a
okay.
very
I
interesting
was
setup
waiting that
today.
I thought
I was
Yeah.
waiting. I was waiting.
I thought Josh might want to jump in. My antagonist is has not been introduced and probably won't be introduced directly until the third act. But there's a character that you think is the antagonist that is actually how do I say this without
Not.
yeah, not there's a there's a quasi antagonist that you start rooting for because you realize they're not the actual antagonist until you get to kind of this big bad battle, if you will. So I'm handling a little differently. That's not it. It's not so much um, a a trick for the reader that you're subbing something out. It's not that, but it's the story evolves and changes until you get a real look at what's going on.
It's interesting because when you mentioned before that is a truck driver
Yeah.
realizes that they're being subbed in for this deal,
Right.
like that's where my mind immediately went to for
Yeah.
antagonism and conflict. And interestingly enough, even I mean, it sounds like there's more to the story, but even
Yeah.
if that was the story, because our protagonist is the one who made the deal with the devil, then the antagonist is technically his victim at that point, right?
Exactly.
Because he's working
Exactly.
counter to the protect. That's cool.
Yes. Yes.
I'm
Yes.
excited. I'm excited to read your story.
Yeah. It's yeah. It's going to be a lot of fun. Anyway.
And sort of like Harper says here, my antagonist is a red herring. They aren't the problem. It's the main character.
Exactly. Exactly.
I kind of view
but-
antagonists on 2 different levels, because you can have antagonists that aren't the bad guy. and you can have antagonists that are kind of just obstacles in the way of what the main character is trying to do. By definition, they're just going against what the main character is trying to do. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they are the bad guy to this story. So I have a number of antagonists that are either working, what they're trying to do goes against what the main character is doing, even though they aren't technically working against him. And then I have the bad guy antagonist that would be the leader of the Korean spy team that is there, and I do introduce him. He'll be introduced kind of really closely after the inciting incident, and I like having the good guy and the bad guy, protag and antag, on equal footing in terms of skill and capability. And so the main bad guy is going to be just as skilled and smart as my main character, and even and I try to look at it in kind of concert with each other, because the bad guy is the antagonist of the good guy, but then I reverse it and make the good guy the antagonist of the bad guy, and it that helps me write out the sequences easier, because when I'm writing from the bad guy's perspective, I'm not trying to write it like a mustache twirling bad guy where he's just like intent on world destruction or whatever else. He's trying to do something, and the good guy is working against him trying to do that. And so I approach it as kind of both characters are their own protagonists and antagonists in terms of how I write it. Um, because I like to, in that tri-fail cycle, you can do the tri-fail cycle for multiple characters. It doesn't have to be just a tri-fail cycle for your main good guy. The bad guy can also have a tri-fail cycle, and they should, if you're writing multiple POVs like that, where you're presenting the bad guy point of view and the good guy point of view, so that the bad guy also has fails in what he's trying to do, but they might not necessarily be successes from the good guy's point of view, if that makes sense. And then I also have smaller antagonists that are not working directly against the main character, but through their actions, they hinder what the main character is doing. A great example of this is how they wrote Infinity War, Avengers. And if you look at that story from the perspective of Thanos, it's a hero's journey. And they wrote it specifically like that, so that it would, from Thanos's point of view, he won. And obviously, Endgame happens and he loses, but that Infinity War is basically Thanos's hero journey. And he has obviously tri-fail cycles, and so do the Avengers at the same time.
Yeah.
I see that NJ West asked there about what's the difference between an antagonist and an anti-hero. An anti-hero is the main character, in my opinion. It could be different. An anti-hero is the main character of the book, but he does not do heroic things, right? He doesn't have like a good arc. He has it's like Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad is a good example of an anti-hero, where the protagonist of the story is not a good dude, and he's doing really bad things. Even though we're rooting for him to succeed, he's doing really bad things. That, in my mind, is the definition of an anti-hero. And an antagonist in that story is the DEA or the cops that are working against him. And that classification of working against the person that is the main character in your story.
Yeah, spot on. That's exactly what I was going to say to that question. Anti-heroes are so much fun.
Yeah.
I love them. But even someone like Deadpool, since we're referencing Marvel movies, can be very anti-hero, because he will pursue his own goal that seems like a good goal, save his girlfriend or save the kid in the second one, or I love the third movie. Oh, I'm obsessed with it. But he'll, do a whole lot of murder and stuff along the way. So that's not
It also
heroic.
really the perspective of an individual also kind of guides that too, because in some, like if you look at Man of Steel, the the Superman movie, if you were like a business owner in Metropolis,
Mhm.
Superman would
Right.
be an anti-hero because they
Yep.
destroyed like millions of dollars of property, and maybe he did save the day, but in their perspective, in their view, he wasn't a hero because you just cost him, millions and millions of dollars in destruction during that fight. So it's really that antag protag is a matter of perspective, and as a writer, you have to be able to identify that perspective and not write it as a bad guy, good guy, if that makes sense. Unless
Mhm.
that's the thing that you're trying to create. If you're writing a Sauron and he is the Lord of Darkness, then okay, I can see where you wouldn't have to have any perspective issues with that. But if you're writing like a cozy mystery or even a romance have antagonists, and they're
Mhm.
not necessarily bad people, right? So
Yeah. Yeah. Often in a romance, the antagonist is actually the love interest,
mhm.
because the love interest does something that stops the protagonist from finding love, at least temporarily, or achieving a goal, or what have you. It's always that direct
Yeah.
conflict between a protagonist and antagonist, or maybe not always direct, but there is conflict, there is opposition
Yeah.
between
At,
them.
at the risk of pulling a random comment out of context that's going on in the chat over here, the difference between an antagonist and an enemy, says Shimina. Uh,
I'm going
sorry,
with Shamina, but also,
Shemina.
yeah, and
That's
same thing,
perfect. Yeah,
Valentine. I've been saying Valentine, but if I'm mispronouncing anyone's name, please let me
yeah,
know.
yeah. We don't mean to. We're just
Yeah, it's tough when it's
knuckle
text.
draggers sometimes, and don't. But yeah, that sometimes your antagonist is not necessarily your enemy, and it all comes down to the protagonist perspective and what this other person is doing to them, or that they feel is doing to them. But as we all know, like you alluded to in the Marvel universe, everyone is the hero of their own story. So just
Mhm.
because
Right.
you're antagonist to this protagonist, maybe those roles are reversed if you look at it from the other perspective. And
Yeah.
that's the author's job to find different perspectives and to be able to tell that story in a new way to let us see the world with new eyes.
Now I want to go over to one of NJ's other questions here, and that is, how do you write an antagonist the reader will hate if you love them? So from your definition there, Hank, everyone's the
Yeah.
hero of their own story. I love, love, love making my antagonist's motivation and goals very apparent. And even if the goals are, the murder of our protagonist or something very vile, I like to come up with a motivation that makes that justifiable. And if we relate to Thanos again, he saw his entire planet destroyed, and so he wants to eliminate half of everything for a greater good because in his mind it makes sense, right? So I love doing that. But then when you get so attached to them, how do you make it so the reader doesn't also get attached to them? And then it's just like, okay, I hate the protagonist. I want the antagonist to win. And in some genres, it's easier than others. For dark fantasy, yeah, I give him a good motivation and a justifiable goal, but then he does some vile things in the in between, right? Or he's very actively working against my protagonist, and so it gets frustrating because he makes those try fail cycles for our main characters. But how do you guys make the antagonist hateful while still making them like a good character, or not hateful but able to be hated with while making them a good character?
I spend a lot of time obviously trying to for myself build empathy with the antagonist or the enemy for myself in terms of what he's trying to do and trying to make him the hero of his own story. But what I do to make the reader not like him or her is that I build up an emotional connection between something or a person to the main character, and I build that up more, and I make that matter more to the reader than anything else, and then I take it away. And I usually have the enemy take that away. So the good example of that is if you really like a bad guy that you're writing, and you're like, yeah, how do I make the reader hate this guy? Have him kick a puppy, and then the reader will automatically hate that guy. And that's very simple, but like you can build that emotional relevance or resonance to something in your book, whether it's a person or a thing or whatever it is, an idea, and then have your bad guy step all over that, and that will trigger in some cases, an reasonable emotional response to the antagonist's actions. Man, that's really hard to say. Antagonist's actions. And usually that works. I'm trying to think if I have any bad guys in my books that I really, really enjoyed writing, which I look at the bad guy and the good guy the same way in terms of liking the character, because they both serve the same story. But I see what you're saying about like loving the bad guy character and like having a lot more fun writing the antagonist point of view and doing all that kind of dastardly stuff that you get to do as an antagonist. But a lot of times that comes naturally too. Like a lot of times you don't have to convince your reader to hate the antagonist, because they're not approaching it from the way you're approaching it. They're approaching it from they open the page and just read it. They're not looking at it through your lens of story. And so a lot of times it's easier than you think.
Yeah.
For me, I like to write characters that are sort of gray. The story I'm writing now, you've got the hitchhiker who obviously wants to do horrible things to the other character, but then you start getting to see his life through his perspective, and you realize that he's a victim in a lot of ways of something that he wasn't really counting on, and that can you run the risk of the reader really wanting to latch onto this character because they're sorry for him. And I guess one of the things that you have to do is to make sure that you highlight that he does heinous things, and you can't let your sympathy for the character overshadow the reality of his actions. I mean, we can all understand how someone winds up in a bad situation. We can all understand and feel empathy for them, but then at the end of the day, their actions are their actions, and they have to be
100%.
responsible for what they do. And for me, when you're dealing with that, you can build sympathy and empathy, and you can really, emotionally connect with that character, but then you have to also be aware of what they do, how they respond to it, and the actions they take. And that ultimately is the determining factor for what kind of person they are, is how they act on those things.
I like it. Awesome. All right. Now we are almost at an hour, 15 minutes. So I'm going to assign some homework. And then we have a couple questions that we've saved till the end. And I'm a man of my word, so we're going to answer some of those questions. So homework. The theme for this month is writing. Keep writing. We don't have any extra exercises in the 60-day template for you to do. We have some stuff to think about, some things to guide you in your writing, but just write. You got a lot of words to write, folks.
Yeah.
Share your progress in the Storycraft Cafe. A lot of people, like dozens and dozens every day, are sharing the amount of words that they are writing, whether you hit that 1667 or not. I love seeing it. It's so inspiring for me and other people. And if you have questions, or you're struggling with something, or you just want to share something else, join us in the cafe. Easy as that. Hank, do you mind grabbing a link for the Storycraft Cafe while I continue assigning homework?
It is storycraft.cafe, but I'm going to post that in the chat.
Harper, the Storycraft Cafe is an online community of writers, both dabblers and non-dabblers alike. It is made and run by Dabble, but it is open to everyone. And that's where we've been hosting the community for the 60-day novel challenge, which coincides with NaNoWriMo here. A lot of people participating in NaNoWriMo have joined us over there as well to support one another and encourage one another.
And
But
it
there
is
you go.
think of it as a social media site like a Facebook, like a Twitter, whatever, but only for writers and only for writing.
Yeah.
So there's we are as diverse and as spread across the spectrum of people as you can imagine, but we're there for one single purpose, and that's to talk about writing, to share what we're going through, to motivate each other, to post questions and get other people's perspectives, all the good vibes in a self-contained place where you don't have to deal with all the other stuff of social media to get to a certain group. This is insulated, isolated, good vibes only.
Good vibes is a great way to describe it because
Yeah.
it's only been good vibes when I've
Yeah.
logged in to check it out.
100%.
It
And
also
I've been posting my word count each morning when I do my and it was just at first it was just a little, yay, look what I did. But now I've come to, like, I feel like, whether they are or not, don't get me wrong, I kind of feel like people are expecting, like, what did Hank do today?
Yeah.
So I feel obligated now to
Yep.
pop in and post my word count. Just
Mhm.
and more than anything, it keeps me honest, and it keeps me, that, oh, I've got to get this done today because someone's going to be there watching and they're going to say, oh, Hank didn't get his words today, and I don't want to let anybody down.
And I know a lot of people tuning in right now were in the writing sprints that we did before this. But if you want to do more writing sprints, or if you're watching this afterwards because you can't make them during the day, the cafe is a great place to find other people to do sprints with you.
Yeah.
There's always someone looking for sprints over there.
Yeah,
And
I guarantee if you're just looking for a motivation partner, if you post in there, hey, I want to do a writing sprint an hour from now, who's game? I guarantee you'll get someone that'll be there to motivate with you.
Absolutely. Part 3 of your homework, join us for a writing sprint. We are hosting them every day, Monday to Friday, 12:30 p.m. Eastern time. We'll do 3 20-minute sessions for the most part. On Thursday, we are doing a 3-hour marathon that will be hosted by Hank and Robert. And yeah, we're trying to get all of those words in this month. And then my last bit of homework before we move on to the Q&A is just be mindful of yourself. A lot of people doing this challenge are not used to writing this much. So make sure you aren't burning yourself out. Make sure you're giving yourself time to get up and stretch. If you've been sitting with us at your computer since the start of the writing sprint until now, we've been sitting for like 3 hours at this point. Get up, stretch your legs, be mindful of your joints, your neck, your eyes, and then like your mental energy as well.
Go walk the dog or let the dog walk you.
Yeah. Okay. So let's jump into a couple questions here. We're going to try and wrap up by the half hour. But we have from the start, Sunza asked, question for all three of us. What do you think about jumping between writing scenes all over the story compared to writing linearly? And I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. But if you guys don't mind, I'm going to take a stab at it first, and then I'll get your thoughts. I've been very vocal for the last couple of shows that if you find yourself thinking about a future scene that you're really excited for and it's really weighing you down in your current scene, or you're just not motivated to write your current scene, just jump ahead. Just go ahead and write it. I have like my current draft of my bigger novel, not the one I'm working on this month, but my other one. It has like 6 or 7 unfinished scenes that I'm going to have to go back and finish once I reach the end. But that's because I petered out, or I was really excited for the next chapter, or 3 chapters away. I'm like, I need this momentum. I need some more spark. I'm just going to let this sit for a little bit. And then I can come back, and especially if I didn't know what I wanted to write, I can come back with the knowledge of what's happening next and use that to help me figure out what kind of blocks I might have had. What about you guys? Josh, we haven't heard from you in a while.
I mean, I kind of do the same thing, and I kind of I use it for 2 things. One, I use it if I'm stuck on a scene, I'll just jump to the next one and keep writing. But also 2, there are, because the kind of writing that I do, sometimes there are things that I come up with in writing other scenes that affect previous scenes or will affect other scenes ahead of that. Usually that's small things like the stuff I was talking about, the bottom of the show where we're throwing in context clues through dialogue and kind of narrowing down exposition or something like that. A lot of times I'll come up with that just through the natural course of writing, and sometimes that will fit better in a different scene. So I'll kind of mix and match and kind of piece things around while I'm working. And then sometimes I'll get to a portion of the scene where I'm like, I need a bridge from A to C and I don't know what B is. And so I'll just make a space in the document and say, I don't know what I'm doing here. And then just keep going because I know where C is and I know where C is going. Because inevitably it'll come to me at some point in time, and then I can go back in and add it later. Usually it's not the bigger portions of the story that slow me down. It's the little things that I try to get right. And usually that slows me down a little bit. And usually I save that for later if I can manage it. Like for instance, if I don't know a name of something, I'll just write name in all caps and keep going and then go back and fix it later.
Wow. I put insert world building details at the start of a scene the other day because I just didn't want to write what the setting was like. I just wanted to get into the action.
I fully appreciate the fact that you should be able to jump ahead and write a scene that you're passionate about when you should be writing this previous scene. I fully endorse that you can do that. I can't do that. I have to write linearly. I fully appreciate that you can, and if your brain lets you do that, wonderful. I can't do that. I would love to say that I can, but I can't. It is
Fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, different styles for different people.
Yeah, I find myself like I know what I'm gonna write. I could write chapter 12 tomorrow because I know how it's gonna go. But the whole time I'll be thinking about, am I gonna put something in here that's gonna mess up chapter 6, which I should be writing tomorrow? And I don't need that kind of stress in my life.
A lot of the times I do it with if I've got multiple POVs in a certain
Yeah.
book, sometimes I'll write out like a significant portion of those
Yeah.
POVs right in a row, even if they don't slot narratively in the book right next
Yeah.
to each other. I'll batch them, which is something I'm doing in Weaponized, and I batch a whole series of chapters for one character's POV, and then go back in and slot them narratively back into the structure of the book, just because I tend to, if I'm writing a certain character for a long time, I really click with the
Yeah.
mindset of that character and their attitudes and how they speak and how they move and how they act. And sometimes it's just easier to kind of burn through 2 or 3 or 4 of those chapters,
Yeah.
take a breath, let that sit for a minute, and then go work on another one. And then I'm not always having to wrap my mind around the mindset or the attitude of the particular character if I'm going like jumping from one character to another character to another character.
See, now that's a perfect way to keep the neurosis at bay.
I don't know about that. I don't know about that at all.
Yeah.
But it works for me.
I do like that though.
I've mentioned this a couple of times in the premium office hours that Hank and I host. That's exactly what I did for my current draft. I have 3 kind of plot lines in it, and 2 of them they intersect towards the end, just before the climax. And I completely ignored one until I wrote the other 2 up until that intersection point. Like, okay, I got to go back and do this now because I need to figure out what's happened this whole time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's see. Okay. Would it be more reasonable to get the bare bones of the story and then go back and add color, or is that a bad idea? And that's from Valentine. That's
what I'm doing.
Yeah, I think that's what we're all doing. This is
Yeah.
when you're trying to write 50,000 words in 30 days. If that's not your normal pace, then yeah, just get them down, revise them after. We in agreement with that?
100%
Absolutely.
agree.
Yeah.
Very knowledgeable gentleman up here too.
Well, and sometimes I mean, for a lot of times the color doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
The story is what matters, and then all the color is just making it look pretty. So you think of it in terms of drawing a picture. You don't draw and color at the same time. If you're doing like a painting or something, you sketch it out and then you darken up the lines and you kind of make everything in there, and then you go back in with color later and fill it in. That's how I kind of look at
Yeah.
it.
It's like those drawing tutorial videos where like, here's how you draw a face, and they do the circle with like the lines through it, and then step
Mhm.
2 is like the fully detailed face. That's sort of how it works. We do the circles with the line,
Yeah.
and you can do
It's
the
a
rest of the
very
face
horrible smiley face.
Right.
I love watching
Right.
the render sequence of like CG animation where it starts like very rough and then you see the render passes like 5 or
Mhm.
6 times where they're doing a pass on lighting and a pass on texture
Yeah.
or whatever.
That's more like the actual process, yeah.
Yeah.
Andy asking, what software do you recommend for dictation? Josh, you said you used Dragon before. I've used Otter. It does the job, unless you're using like I write fantasy, so the names don't work with Otter
Right.
because it will not understand them. But there's so many different ones out there nowadays.
A lot
I
of
think
them, and Dragon's good. Like you said, with those fantasy names or sci-fi names, it doesn't do very well. You can teach Dragon those names. It takes a little bit, but you can
Yeah.
teach it those names. But honestly, like if you are not like just a dictation guru, I would recommend not spending a buttload of money on software until you know
Mhm.
that you can do it. And if you have a phone, normally you can do dictation. I mean, you can do voice to text on almost any phone, I think, but phones will have like notepads. Yeah, and you could do it there. Just hit the
you could
microphone.
you could
Yeah.
run Dabble on your phone, open up the chapter that you're going to, and then the little microphone above your keyboard right there, just tap that, and
Mhm.
this is a Google Pixel, and the Google keyboard is actually very, very good, and the more that you do it, the better it learns,
Yeah.
your Southern accent and stuff like that I have to compensate for.
Now, with
But
like an
yeah.
Android phone, will it automatically do line breaks? Because something like Otter will, because it's meant to transcribe conversation, so it understands stuff like that.
I don't know, but you can always just say line break, and
Yeah.
it'll insert that.
Yeah. If you
It's
say
just
new line or new paragraph, usually it'll bump down.
Yeah.
right, exactly. And no matter what software you're using, you've got to figure out those little
Yeah.
idiosyncrasies that tell it how to translate what you're saying.
Yeah. All
The
right.
hardest thing for if you're doing dictation, like to actually do it for a finished product is being okay with doing all the punctuation verbally, like open
Yeah,
Mhm.
quote, blah 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 blah, comma, close quote, somebody said, period. It gets really easy once you've been doing it for a long time. I can do it.
Mhm.
But if you're just doing like a first draft, none of that matters because you're gonna have to edit it anyway. So you can just say
right.
the dialogue and then go something, comma, he said or whatever, and then just keep going because you're gonna have to edit it anyway. The words will get jumbled or it'll mishear what you say. And but I would definitely recommend being comfortable with actually doing the process before buying software for it.
Yeah, for sure. And if you already have a phone, try that and just see if, because the biggest hurdle, I think the dictation software is probably one of those things that's like a 15 to 20% problem. The 80% is you dictating your story. I think that's the bigger hurdle. And
Yeah.
do it into your phone and practice that for free with what you already have, and then see if that other 20% is going to be worth it for you. That's what I
Yeah.
would say.
All right. I have 3 more for us to tackle. We'll try and move through them a little quickly here. Another one from Sunza. When do you read what you've written since November 1st? That differs depending on the person. So for myself, for example, I'm not going to read it until December 1st. Actually, I'm probably not going to read it until January 1st, 2nd. But Hank, you edited some of your work today during our writing sprint.
Yeah.
You got your writing in earlier, and then you went back
Yep.
and fixed it up.
Yeah, and for me, that's generally what I do. I say I'm going to leave it alone and not read it, but it, tomorrow morning when I get up for my writing session, I'm going to read back over what I wrote today. I may not change anything. I'm going to read over. It really just kind of helps me to get in the flow of the story, even though I know I've got my story beats. I know what I need to write, but it helps me to get back into the character's headspace and to kind of hit the ground running, so to speak. And it's not that I'm going back and editing what I'm doing, but I am reading over it just to get that feeling back, and that helps me. So,
Anything to add, Josh?
It really depends on where I'm at in the process. There are some days where I'll go back and reread what I've written the day before, but there's other days that I know basically what happened, and so I'll start writing. I mean, inevitably you'll read it like a dozen or more times by the time you're done with it. But if I'm actively drafting, I don't spend a lot of time reading what I wrote already. I just keep pressing forward because inevitably you read it, and I cannot read what I wrote and not fix it.
Yeah.
And so if I go back and I read a page, I'll spend an hour rewriting that page or editing it or doing whatever I do, and so I just choose not to do that. I just keep pressing forward and writing.
yeah.
All right. Second
One
last
thing
one.
can I say this real quick? I think
No.
we talked about this last week. That when I'm reading back over, and invariably I'll fix some things, instead of erasing and typing new, I'll strike through what I wrote and then put another word there or rephrase it in it differently. And I think that helps me to see that this is a work in progress, but I also see like what my thought process was, because I see the old way I worded it, I see the new way. I may come back another time and then I see the two different things, and maybe it'll trigger something. But I like the idea of leaving the old one, but striking through. It's a different way of thinking for me. I always have erased and set it in stone, if you will, there. But I like the idea of seeing the editing process in process there. It's kind of creatively liberating.
Yeah. All right. We have Mina here asking, what are your thoughts on flawed heroes? I think a lot of books are very moralizing in the sense that main characters are often portrayed with a modern morality and mindset, which can be a little jarring. And then part two added, especially when the setting is neither 2024 nor Earth. And my opinion on this is that it kind of depends on the genre. If you're doing like a very accurate historical fiction, then this kind of thing is going to be very off-putting to a reader because they're reading it for accuracy. If you're doing it for something like fantasy or sci-fi, I'd argue that it's up to you. And I argue that because I have to put this in an appropriate way. In A Song of Ice and Fire, it was pointed out that all the characters doing the dirty are like not old enough to be doing that. And then some people would argue that's medieval times. That's, if you go back in history, people were getting married at like 14 or whatever, and having kids around then.
Yeah.
To which I then counter with, it's not historical fiction, it's a fantasy universe. You can make up whatever you want. So like I'm not trying to say that George R.R. Martin has these different views than I do, but I personally, when I write fantasy, I don't include stuff like that might have historically happened, because I'm making this world and I can make up whatever I want.
Yeah. Well, I've got a couple thoughts there. Song of Ice and Fire began 3 decades ago. Let's not forget that. And it began as a loosely veiled retelling of the War of the Roses. So
Right.
all of those things mattered in the context of the War of the Roses 30 years ago. So that, take from that what you will. I write a lot of stories based in the rural South. Some of them have taken place 30, 40 years ago. Don't know if you've ever read a history book. There was some wild stuff happening in the rural South 30, 40 years ago. and I would be
First of all, there's still some wild stuff happening in the rural South now.
yeah, and let's not
Yeah.
even talk about Kansas, what goes on there.
Yeah, I know. Let's not.
yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah. I choose to just not go very deep on some of that stuff because one, I don't write stories where those things matter greatly to the context of the story. Don't hear me saying something I'm not saying. But you know, the uh it's just not gonna help what I'm writing, and I think the way I tell stories is not gonna hurt either that I dodge around some of that stuff. I just don't want to get mired in the quicksand of of a thing that doesn't matter to the story I'm telling. So if I'm gonna tell a historically accurate portrayal of what my grandparents went through, you know, at a certain time, then that's a different story. But most things that I write are kind of magical realism. It's the real world, but with some other stuff happening, and I just choose to just not go there for a lot of reasons. But that's how I approach it. Is it, you know, it's fantasy. It doesn't have to be. I don't have to show you the entire world as accurately as it was.
I think, in my opinion, I think sometimes flaws get taken to the nth degree, and they
Yeah.
aren't necessarily needing to go that far. For instance, you could have a character flaw that is just a personal perception of himself, and that's a flaw in and of itself. It could be a small
Right.
thing, and depending on what that thing is, it could be the focus of the story, or it could just be a part of the character. You know, is flawed heroes. I mean, everybody's flawed in some fashion. You know, everybody has some thing that is uh, not lining up with the greater character, right? So it doesn't have to be that he's got some weird, I don't know, something. It could just be that, you know, he something happened to the character uh previous in his life, and that affects how he views events going forward. That could be a flaw in the way that he goes forward through the story. It could be that he had a bad relationship and now he hates whatever, men or women or whatever it is, and that could be a flaw, right? Like that is a flaw that affects his character, not necessarily that there's something wrong or bad about him. It's just how that event shaped him as a person. So sometimes like the flaws can be just real little. They can be just uh tangential to the story. Where it becomes a big thing is that flaw central to the story, and does it affect
Right.
how the character moves through the story? If
Yeah.
it's a flaw that you're addressing as part of your story, then of course it's going to be a big thing and you've got to focus on it. But if it's just a flaw in terms of personality or the way that he deals with people, maybe he thinks he's never wrong, that could be a flaw. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not an evil thing, right? But it is a flaw that he would have to overcome. So I think flawed heroes are great. Perfect heroes are super boring. Like they really are super boring. They're not
Yeah.
interesting to read, and they're not. You can't identify with them because, like, even if you won't admit it, there are flaws that everybody has. You know, consciously or subconsciously, and having those in fiction is just. I mean that it makes sense, right? So I love flawed heroes.
Yeah. I think so. I focused a lot more on the second part of the question, and I'm glad you brought it back to the flawed heroes part, because I think every hero or protagonist needs flaws, because that's the things that you kind of pick at to make conflicts and obstacles for them. Right. And I've long argued that perfect characters like Superman without weaknesses or flaws is boring. Right. I just saw a YouTube short of him from the latest Justice League movie, I think, where the main bad guy hits him with his big axe and it does nothing. And I'm like, okay, well, this isn't a bad guy. That there's no threat here. You're just and then he blows on it and shatters it because of his ice breath or whatever. So yes, flaw is very important. And Mina pointed out more thinking about historical fiction in Regency Britain, with the aristocratic male main character being all pro-free expression for the female ton members, which is very detailed, very specific. But you're right. Like again, you have a little bit of play with that, because if it's a historical romance, for example, people might want to see a male character embody some of those values. That might be more interesting for them. If you're going for more historical accuracy, there were people who were like that, but they were very few and far between. It's like when, like, you actually, no, I'm not going to get into it. I was about to leverage my political science degree. Decided that's a conversation.
Well, but to your point, they're definitely. It is not unreasonable to say that that kind of character didn't exist in that time period. They just weren't common, or they weren't famous, or not notable, or whatever. And so it's not unrealistic for that. Yeah.
All right. Okay. One more question. I know we're even over the hour and a half mark, but this one came up multiple times, and I think Harper summarized it best here. What do you guys do when that passion for, or when you, what do you guys do to find that passion for your stories to write them? Have you ever lost it? How do you get it back? Hank, this will make for a good fireside chat, I think, come December.
Yeah.
But yeah, this happens to me. It's happened to me before. I burned myself out on projects and then couldn't get back into another project. The messy middle, the muddy middle is a real thing, and you lose steam sometimes. For me personally, take a break, or jump ahead, or write something else. Like, those are my big three, I think. And it depends on where my mind's at. If I'm burned out on writing, I just need a break. If you have a deadline, that's different. Since we're writing 50,000 words in 30 days, you have to manage the breaks that you can allow yourself. But that might mean adjusting your goal to maybe 50,000 words isn't the actual goal you're aiming for, if you find your lack of passion isn't letting you write as much as you need to reach that goal. Maybe just aim for 20,000 words, and then you can write the rest afterwards once that passion has been kind of rekindled. What about you, gents?
For me, yeah, it's about managing expectations. It's about being in a place where I can think about the story that I'm writing, so that and make sure that I'm passionate about the story I'm writing. I have some friends, we won't name names, but I've got some people that I know very well that write books that sell very well, but it's not necessarily their passion. And they do this because it's their livelihood. And while I appreciate that, I really do, I'm not in the position, like, I have a day job. I don't have to write things that I'm not passionate about to pay the bills. So for me, writing is a passion and something that I also make money from. But it's not my primary source. So I get to be passionate about the things that I write about, and for me, that's important. Also, I'm in the enviable position to get to talk with authors for a living. I do interviews at least twice a week with people from all over the spectrum that write all kinds of stories for all different reasons. And I get to talk with them and pick their brain. And so I would say, find a podcast. Our Storycraft Cafe podcast is a great one. We have tons, and we've got almost 200 author interviews there. And, listen to people talk about writing. For me, that's a huge motivator to see how storytelling, affects people and the way they move through the world. That's a big motivator for me.
I don't know that I've, in terms of of writing a story, I don't know that I've ever lost the passion for that story. But I'm not trying to write the Iliad. I'm just trying to write stuff that I enjoy writing
Yeah.
and that I want to read. And so, in terms of having passion for a project, my passion is just writing in general and telling the
Right.
stories that I want to write. I have had to deal with on a specific project that I uh, because of circumstances that weren't related to the story, found myself hating it and had a really, really, really hard time finishing it. But it didn't have anything to do with the story. There was a whole bunch of other stuff going on. And it took me a really long time to work through that. And then when I got to a place where I was able to start a new project and write what I wanted to write again, then it all clicked back into place. And I think if you like writing stories, and you like the story that you're writing, the passion for the story is always going to be there. Now, writing is hard, and there are many times where that story, even if you have passion for it, will be extremely difficult to write. You'll sit down and look at the page, and you have no idea what you're going to do. And that I don't think falls into the line of passion, because you have the passion for the story. It's there. It's just that the getting through that hard bit of writing, that's difficult sometimes. And it just hitting the keys right after the other, and getting that any words down will help you keep going forward. And the if you don't have the passion, this is a simple answer. If you don't have passion at all for writing, don't do it. There's way more better things to do to
Yeah.
make a living and to enjoy. But if you really, really have a passion for writing, the story, you may get to a point in the story where it falls off and you lose interest in it, but that doesn't mean you don't have passion for it.
Mhm.
It just means that maybe that story wasn't for you. Start a new one, right? Like just
Yeah.
and another part of that is maybe like you said earlier, set your goal at 20,000 words rather than 50. But meet those expectations. If you're writing your first book, don't set up to write a 300,000 word epic fantasy novel. Write a 50,000 word fantasy novella,
Mhm.
and don't put any subplots in it. Write A to B and have fun writing that and enjoy that process. And then as you get better and learn and grow as a writer, the longer, bigger stuff will come. And yeah.
Yeah. So, Harper, two things I would encourage you to do. One, figure out if it's actually the passion that is gone or the story itself that's the issue, or if there's something in life that is stressing you out, because that has such a tangible effect on your writing, especially in such a big time crunch like this challenge. But also, I don't know if you were there for the NaNoWriMo workshop on Friday, but I made everyone swear an oath to no 0 days, which is just you have to write at least one word every single day. So I need you to swear to that. You know, it doesn't have to be a blood oath, but it can if you want. But at least one word a day. Maybe aim for like 20 to 50 words a day. And then if you're inspired to write another 50 that day, excellent. If you're not, you're writing it the next day anyway. So just do that. Aim for no 0 days and just try and figure out what specifically is bugging you. And if it is about your story, then you can change that aspect of it too.
It's 50,000 words, not 50,000 stories. So if you
That's
write a
right.
1,000 words in a story and you hate it, start another one and keep the
Yeah.
words and keep going. It doesn't mean that you've failed the challenge because you didn't finish the book that you started for the challenge. If you get 15,000 words in and want to start a new one, start a new one. It's just the words. That's all that matters.
Yeah.
And I don't know a single writer that doesn't have a folder on their computer with abandoned stories that they're
Right.
afraid to throw away because there might be something good in there that I can harvest for another story. And I have 100% I've written stuff and like, this isn't going anywhere, but I'll hold on to it. And then sure enough, that scene would fit perfectly in this book. I'll just reword this and it slots right in.
Yep.
Yep.
And Valentine, Judy, and TW all saying that the oath is working to no 0 days, and Harper has agreed to it. So excellent. All right, folks. With that, I know there's a lot of questions. There are more questions that we couldn't get to, but we're coming up on the 2-hour mark almost. So
Talk
we
about
unfortunately
verbose.
have to bid you adieu today. Thank you so much for joining us. Get those words written. Our next show is going to be next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern. We will talk more about the second act and maintaining that momentum, and then answer a whole bunch of questions. Join us in the Storycraft Cafe in the 60-Day Challenge community. Subscribe here on YouTube. Leave a like if you thought this was valuable. That's always reassuring for us to see.
Yep.
And other than that, just thank you for joining us. We'll see you later.
And writing sprints tomorrow at 12:30
12:30
Eastern time.
Yep.
And right after that, we have an interview with science fiction author Richard Fox, a friend of the show, who's we're going to talk about how he took his passion for writing into a career. And it's going to be a lot of fun. Richard's always fun to hang out with. So
ask him about pterodactyls.
Pterodactyls. Let me make a note.
I promise you it's a good story.
Okay. All right. Got it. Will do.
Gotta watch it now. All right. Bye, everyone.
All right. See you.